We have an open room. It's 1 o'clock.
Yes.
Okay.
Live.
The room is open?
Yes, I see people are,
Okay,
the numbers are quickly ticking up.
fantastic. It's 1 o'clock, so I see that the numbers are ticking up. I want to welcome everybody to the webinar today. If you've been on other webinars, I've already introduced myself. I'm the program director for the PISOs program. And on behalf of the PISOs team, I want to thank you for joining us today. Remind you that today's session has been designed for Q&A largely. We're going to spend just a few minutes to get oriented on how we're going to do this so we can get through all of your questions, or as many as we can. As a reminder, this is about the PISOs program. I know you'll have lots of questions around a range of topics, everything from maturity of ecosystems, what do we mean by the assets, sustainability, but you're probably also going to have questions about more, I think, procedural kinds of things, like how do you submit to NSF? What does the team makeup need to be on the I-Corps? So we've got a strategy to get through these things. Reed is here with me, and he's going to go through the Q&A box, and he's going to help cull that and triage. So one down now to next. Just to remind you, our program page and our QR code. If you connect to this, you'll be able to get to the mailbox and other resources that are posted to the page. As I promised, we'll just talk a little bit about what we're going to go through today, how we're going to go through it. The welcome I just gave you, I'll try not to talk too fast, but I do want to get through as many questions as possible. We'll talk about the format and how we're going to get through and triage all of these questions. I will start and kick everything off with a seed question, and then we're going to open it right up for attendee Q&A. And then we have a couple of comments in the closing and next steps. So, as I mentioned, Reed's going to be scanning the Q&A queue. That is in your Q&A box, if you will. We're going to try to answer, we will be answering those programmatic and strategic questions as they're conceptual in nature, and we're going to save those instructional type questions in a separate webinar. If you've got something that's very specific to your project or your entity, please send those to the mailbox. It's very hard for us to do this live. We try to reframe things in a more general nature, but I know sometimes you have questions that are very particular. So feel free to put those in the mailbox, and we'll try our best to get to those, and we'll stay focused on those programmatic and strategic and conceptual kinds of questions. We're going to ask you to also tag your questions. Hopefully it's simple, and we think that's going to help us really get to the crux of what you're asking. Sometimes it's straightforward, other times it's not. It also really helps us see where the community is, who we have here, and what kinds of questions are being raised. So as I mentioned, we're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A box. I think they can start doing that now, right? Is that right? There's nothing stopping them.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So when you put a question in, we're going to ask you to tag it. And please tag it as one of these. I used to have numbers, but just something quickly so that we know exactly what you're trying to get at, and then your organization. So you might put something like sustainability, and then you put your organization nonprofit, and then ask your question. That really helps us sort through what you might be thinking and to offer up a broader response. As I mentioned, hold for future webinars or the mailbox questions around proposal submission and merit review. We'll have a webinar for that that's specific for that. Budget and cost. We're also going to have a separate webinar that's included in that, and things around team members, eligibility, those kinds of more specific things that are in the solicitation. All right, so we're going to start with a seed question to give you a sense of the kind of questions that we're hoping to get through today. What it will also do is give Reed a chance to scan the mailbox as others are trying to put questions in there. So Reed, if you wouldn't mind putting that tags in there and dump it in the mailbox so that they can see that again, so they're reminded of what they should be, how they should be tagging.
Okay, will do.
Okay. All right. While he's doing that, I'm going to seed us with a first question, and the two that we're going to look at, because I think it's the same response, or the next slide is going to help us with a response to both. We get a lot of questions around the maturity of the ecosystem and how that relates to a track 1 or track 2 submission. So how do you judge that? And then we get questions about, is there a minimum size? So, questions about contributors, maintainers, and how that also relates. So I think these two are very similar in nature. And as we think about this, and I don't think just the box isn't obscuring the view, right? Read, the box is not, I can't see. Okay. So what we've done is draw this map. If you've reviewed for us before, you probably have seen this or thought about it. If you haven't, this is new. So I'm going to give everybody a minute to look at it. I'll give you a little background on it. To the left-hand side of this slide, what you're looking at is a situation where you have a very nascent or new ecosystem. We've overlaid your asset or your tool on top of this. So on the left-hand side is a nascent ecosystem with a tool or asset that's on the relatively newer side. And as you move to the right, this becomes an open ecosource in the target that we're looking for all of you guys to work with. So we've also then across the top of that is bracketed where a track 1 would fit. So those are track 1s are 300,000. These are newer ecosystems, perhaps tools that would not be fully self-sustaining, aspects of it are not fully mature yet. And as you move to the right, then we think about track 2. These are ecosystems where you have all of your plans in place. You've got probably a much more mature tool, or your thinking around it is much more mature, and you're heading for that self-sustainability that NSF is looking for. So what do we require? Track 1 and track 2, you both have to have a project that is already publicly available. It's got to be functional, and there should be an artifact around that. Our preference is it's already available under an open source license. And oftentimes, right, the devil is in the details. So this is what we're looking for. There may be particulars that when you get into something that we're willing to entertain. Okay. So the last sentence is really important. Your product should really be oriented around meeting a societal or national need. So a public artifact, that's your starting point at both tracks. If you have a nascent or you have no open source ecosystem or something that's really on the lighter side, and you're looking to evaluate or think about or scope what might be possible, you're trying to think about why open source is the way to go, and you really are evaluating your methods, you would fit squarely in a track 1. As you move where you start to really move forward on that, and you convinced yourselves, and you can convince NSF and the reviewers that the OSE is the way to go, and you really do have developers and maintainers, then you're moving right into a track 2. We expect that in both cases that you'd be able to articulate your plans and your rationale in some sort of detail. So we need the detail around it for the particular technology or domain that you're working in, and not just generalities about your planning, as an example. So there is going to be some overlap between those two tracks. We understand that. So there may be, for an example, a more nascent-like track 1 that is starting to feel a little bit like track 2. So we're looking for projects along the continuum. We're looking to have a portfolio that has everything from really nascent to things that are closer to self-sustaining. So I hope this helps answer the difference between a track 1 and a track 2, and how to think about the maturity and mapping those against not only your public artifact, but also the status of your open source ecosystem. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask Reed, what kind of questions? So this was really for just seeding, if you remember, rather than giving everybody sort of a series of pre-prompted questions. So Reed, what do we have up first in the way of questions?
Well, we already have about 50 questions in the chat.
Okay.
A number of them are about what you were just talking about. So I'm hoping that what you just covered about the distinction between track 1 and track 2 answered a lot of the questions that people were asking. I'm trying to find some other topics to cover. So if you if you want to
Sure.
continue with another question, and I'll pick out a couple in the next couple minutes.
And I see Ashley's joined us, so she might actually be able to help you out. You've got an extra set of hands. She's also done this. Okay, we went through, so we're just going to give Reed a minute to get through the many questions that are coming up. And Ashley, maybe you could give him a hand. We get a lot of questions around sustainability. What does that really mean in this context? So I will just say that groups oftentimes focus on solely the financial component of that. And we want you to think about sustainability. Here's our answer. There'll be a couple of slides. It was too much to put on one slide. It's the capacity to continue the effort that you're pursuing. Right. And it doesn't necessarily, I know we think in terms of just the finances and just generating revenue, but you've got to have this diversity of activities, including volunteer participation. You need institutional support, of course. You need partners. Sometimes they're in-kind resources. It's whatever the ecosystem requires, right? So there is no doubt that finances and money are part of that. But being fully financed without contributors or maintainers, for example, just means that you don't have an ecosystem. So you want your effort to continue beyond the beginning of what we're going to seed from NSF. And you need to understand what are all those various resources that you need to do to contribute that. So let me share with you some dimensions of sustainability. So we know that you have to start out with a meaningful problem, and that's going to attract organizations and communities, and they're going to want to, that's the value proposition. Hopefully they're going to want to use it, they're going to want to contribute to it, and they're going to want to support it. You need an organization, so you need somebody or more than one person who ultimately is going to help lead this and help execute those essential functions like communities or compliance within whatever structure you have set up. Partnership development and community support. Talking about maintainer well-being from the Linux Foundation. I really like this, thinking about this is how are you going to really think about those maintainers that are helping you and contributors and not overextending their efforts so that you do have long-term sustainability. So you want to think about what those good practices are, looking at the documentation, transparency, mentoring, so that you have this continuous pipeline of maintainers and contributors. Community, as I mentioned, there's a value proposition to this. How are you going to have users of your effort or your ecosystem and your tool if you don't have a community around it? So the idea is not to be dependent on one person or the original lead institution. This is a legacy to build beyond that initial group. The technical, we can't ignore that. So the asset's not going to stay stagnant. As technologies change, as the broader ecosystem changes, you have to keep up with that through technical updates. So that's part of your sustainability dimension. Of course, governance, roles, making decisions, how is that all done, conflict resolution. And then lastly, I put this because we do understand there's finances around that. So as you think about sustainability, it's easy to get locked in on those finances and budgets and cost, but there are all these other dimensions to it. They all work together. They all work together to think about what does it actually cost in the way of capacity to maintain that effort that you're starting. So, all right. Do we have a question from the audience? Those are my 2C questions.
Sure. Yeah, we have a number of questions about team makeup and the distinction between different roles, whether somebody should be a co-I on the proposer or play a different role in the proposal, and then also if it matters if there's a mix of institutions covered by the team members on a proposal or if they need to be all from one type of institution.
Yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to answer a part of this, give you some things to think about. But the details around this, I think what we'll do is put that into the webinar on August 11th, because it'll get quite detailed. And I think it's helpful to look at the solicitation as you think about it. So your team makeup, over and above I-Core, and how you get the work done is important to think about. So I'm glad somebody asked, or many people asked this question. Can it be distributed across organizations? Absolutely. Right. The roles as with regard to the award itself and who has to execute some of those administrative functions plays into this, as well as the work of the ecosystem. This gets into the roles and responsibilities. Who is going to do what in the ecosystem? How are you going to develop your governance structure? Where does the PI of the proposal versus the team lead play into this? So the short answer is that all of these are very, very important, whether they're a PI or co-PI. First of all, you have to look at the responsibilities for an NSF award. So if you take on that role, if you're positioned to take on that role, meaning that you work for the institution or you have, because PISOs have some requirements as well, then you've got some additional duties with regard to the award itself, in addition to the ecosystem and the effort under this project. So for example, if you've got a collaborator that's working at another institution and they want to be PI, according to the PISOs program, they can't, right? You could engage them as a sub-award, but you couldn't put them as the lead on the PISOs, on the ecosystem building. So that's the way I want you to think about it. I can't get into all the details. I think we'll never get through it. If we do at the very end, I'll bring up some things we can look at in the program solicitation. But very important to look across those roles and responsibilities, separate what's a responsibility of the award from what's the responsibility of the project under the PISOs program. And then you have to overlay on top of it, what are the rules within the PISOs program? Next question.
There are a couple of questions about international collaboration. For instance, whether funding an international collaborator to travel to a workshop is allowed, and also whether licensing a piece of software from a company based outside the US for technical work is allowed.
Yeah, so let me start with a simpler piece of this, and maybe we talked about this under in another webinar. Perfectly fine to have external collaborators that are working internationally. The money from PISOs can't, from the NSF award, can't flow to them. You can still have collaborators, and there's no reason you can't, but your money can't flow to them either directly, obviously, to NSF. So we wouldn't make an award to an institution or through a relationship from the proposal itself. So we would expect that there's other ways you'd have to engage that individual. For example, they could be a maintainer. They could be a contributor. In this case, they wouldn't be a paid, or you'd have to find other means to actually pay them, if you will. What was the second part of the licensing itself? Yeah, we'll have to look into that. Let's punt that one until the August 11th. That's pretty messy. I'm going to ask whoever put that question together if you could give us a little more details around that so we can come back with something more robust.
Another question is about, or there are a couple of questions, I think, about kinds of open source assets that could form the basis of an ecosystem beyond software that it may be the most commonly thought of. Could a data specification count as an open source product? Is one example, and I think there's another question along those lines. So if you could just talk a little bit more about kinds of open source things that can form the basis of an ecosystem beyond software.
Sure. And I'm trying to find, I put a list of, I'm losing my mind. I put a list of exemplar institutions together. So to help people think about this, but in the solicitation, we talk about open source hardware. We talk about platforms. And I know you might think, well, that's a software. I will say sort of broadly thinking about this, is it coming out of the R&D and engineering community? And what is it serving? If the specification in and of itself is like a standard, the answer is probably not. That's not sufficient enough. I would also ask you to think about the intellectual merit. What knowledge might this be moving forward? What communities within a particular domain or beyond a particular technical domain might you be serving? So I think my answer is we're not seeing and we have not supported the development of particular standard or specification. That's not sufficient. This program, we're not building standards. We're building those ecosystems around a technology or an asset. So you've got to ask yourself, what is the technical, what is the intellectual domain within a particular one or beyond that that you're actually moving forward? Let me share with you, because I know we got asked this the last time, and I wanted to give something that went beyond the standards. The typical, I should say, non-standard. All right, so let me go down one. I would encourage everybody to take a look at the portfolio of NSF awards. This link is live when you see this slide, so you can get on the NSF website and you can actually look at the abstracts of things that NSF has supported, both by a list of awards and by state. So it's important to kind of look at the geographic distribution as well as the topical distribution. I've listed a couple here to give you a feel for this. I will say it probably feels a lot like software, but beyond this, you can start looking at like manufacturing practices or documentation or designs, right? So we are taking a broad look at these kinds of things. We have a Q&A list that we're going to try to get to and get it updated. But if you've got a platform and you've got people just uploading raw data, that is not an open source ecosystem. That is, I would ask you to, what intellectual knowledge is being moved forward with the upload of raw data in and of itself? Probably you can't support that now. If that data is being uploaded with models, let's say, that starts to then you can talk about the broadening, right? Broader impacts, not only within the domain or with other domains. So the way to think about it is with NSF's 2 merit review criteria in the context of that. Intellectual merit, what does that bring? And broader impacts. These are really great examples. I don't know that I can trace anything back to NSF in all of these. We probably can at some point, but I think they give you a feel for it. When we get the slides to you, you can link on these things. I will also encourage you just to do a search. Good examples of R&D like open source ecosystems, and you'll get a whole host of hopefully examples that will help you get your head around it. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope it gets to what the person or persons were asking. Next up.
There are quite a few questions about I-Core for PISOs. What the requirement is, how to plan for it, also what the distinguishment is of I-Core for PISOs versus other I-Core programs. So if you could just talk a little bit more about how the I-Core requirement will play into Track 1 awards, I think that would be helpful for a lot of people.
Sure. I'm going to save all of these, what I'm going to consider methodological, the methods piece, right, around for this August 11th, right? Who should be on that? So please join us on that. I'll say that because that information is in this solicitation, but I know sometimes hearing it from NSF is helpful. So what's the difference between NSF I-Core that many people hear us talk about for small businesses versus I-Core for PISOs? So that, I'm going to oversimplify it, but the small business is about commercialization. That is the target. So everything around those discussions and the work that those teams do is about customer discovery for the purposes of commercialization. Within PISOs then, you might commercialize, right, ultimately, but you're building an ecosystem. So not only is our language different, but why you might be looking at not just customers, maintainers, users, contributors are very, very different. So everything's framed within the PISOs program, building an ecosystem versus commercializing your product. So we've done quite a bit of work NSF is to have that syllabus and that work under I-Core tailored to the PISOs program. So if you've done I-Core before and you're saying, I've done this, but I did it for a small business, I think what you'll find is that the focus is very different. It's on building that ecosystem, how to understand, how to do those customer interviews so that you can get to understanding who are your users, who are your maintainers, and what's the need. which may be different than if you're looking to commercialize the product in and of itself. So I'm going to save the details unless Ashley or Reed, they have enough time to get in there and start populating those. But the details of what the team makeup needs to look like, all of that stuff is in the solicitation. We can cover that on August 11th, or if we have time today. So, and Ashley, feel free, as Reed's like looking to, if you have a question that you want to open up your mic and ask, feel free to do that as well.
I think a few people have asked about whether collaborators can be on a team from a for-profit company.
The answer is yes. The purpose of the ecosystem, though, cannot be the primary purpose of this can't be for making money only. So you might have a for-profit company that has an entire set of other business lines. That's perfectly fine. But the ecosystem in and of itself and what NSF is wanting to pursue is not about just solely making money. If that's the case, you probably want to focus on SBIR. That's a good program to be in.
And then there've also been a few questions about security. I think mostly related to track 3, but also how much security should be safety and security should be integrated into the proposals for track 1 and 2. But one particular, so that's the broad topic. One particular question is about track 3 proposals. How should they balance novel security research with applying established security tools into the existing OSE?
Okay, let me try and untangle this. So we would expect you to speak to security. Don't spend a lot of time in this on your track 1 or track 2. That's about the ecosystem building. We do want to hear about what that asset is, and you need to convince the users and, the reviewers in NSF, why this asset? Why does it matter? And then there's a question around, there is a data management and security plan. So you got to be thinking about how is this going to work, right? This is not an R&D proposal. So spending a lot of time on that asset, if you're a track 1, if you're going to spend 6 pages out of your 7, you're probably in the wrong program. We want to hear the ecosystem more broadly, but the asset around which you're going to build that. So I'll give you an example. I think it's probably most obvious. If you're working in the biomedical field and you say nothing about security and privacy, that's going to be a problem, because those are sensitive kinds of data points. If you're working in software or some sort of data, reviewer is going to ask that question, is why is there no discussion of security? If you're thinking about a track 3, the focus there, it's not a continuation of track 2. The focus is there is that class of vulnerabilities more broadly. So you're going to pick one mature ecosystem, more mature asset, and you're going to pick a collection of vulnerabilities and then convince NSF that those classes can be more broadly applied. So whatever solution that you're thinking about, whatever security approaches you're going to use, can they be applied more broadly? We've been asked to, do these have to be really novel approaches? Well, we can imagine there's lots of security holes out there, right? This is an area where not a lot of funding is put towards security, and unfortunately, this stuff proliferates pretty fast in the open source environment. So the answer is, it doesn't have to be novel, but you're going to have to convince the reviewers why this matters, right? If there's more novel techniques that can do a better or have greater impact, so you might raise that and say, well, these are old techniques. And given all of the new, the changes, especially around AI, these old techniques may no longer hold. So you've got perhaps the additional burden of acknowledging whether that approach to those longstanding problems is still a reasonable one. So put it into context. If it's still a longstanding problem, or there are a lot of open source ecosystems that have been around, then convince NSF, convince the reviewers that you can have the same kind of broad impact by the solution that you're proposing. Next question.
Yes. Florence, can you speak to sustainability and what does the program mean by sustainability?
Sure. So I'm going to share this again in case I can pull it up. I go back to our slides, and these were the seed questions. Really urge groups to think beyond just finances, right? These are those sustainability dimensions. Think about it in your ecosystem's capacity to continue what it needs to do to fulfill that effort in the future. So what does that mean, right? These are the things you need to think about. You've got to continue to solve meaningful problems, and you're going to attract other organizations or communities if you have those meaningful problems, right? If you don't have a meaningful problem, first of all, you probably are not going to get funded. But if you do, and you're able to continue making progress towards that, then you need to really start to expand and think about what those other problems are, things that are adjacent to that. You need a managing organization. Who's going to lead that beyond just the one or two people that get the award? So you really want to work yourself out of a job. What's that legacy you're going to build? You want to think about your maintainers. These are the individuals that are going to be in there, especially if you're in software. They're going to be working on the code and making those changes once approved. How are you going to maintain? How are you going to really think about their well-being? If you don't, they're not going to be around forever. Community, you got to have a pipeline. So you can start with a group, but it doesn't continue on its own without work. So you got to have both users, contributors, maintainers. It's a continuous cycle. And we mentioned this leaders, and I can't say this enough, is you really do want to build a plan that moves beyond the one or two people on the award. This is about building an ecosystem, and especially beyond the institution. How that's done, what the rules are, and the structure around that is part of what you need to solve. And of course, the technical piece of this, the asset itself, it can't stay stagnant, otherwise it becomes irrelevant. You need rules and decision-making processes, conflict resolution, your governance. What does that look like? That's probably going to evolve as well in the long term. And then lastly is you need financial and operational. So money does matter. But if you've got some of these other pieces in place, for example, a broad set of institutions, that amount of money, as an example, where you get your money may change. So sustainability is about the capacity to continue the work. And these are dimensions that you must think about and incorporate into the plan.
Two other topics that I've seen come up, so I'll give you one and then we'll go to the other. So one is about size of a proposing team and how to, what a good size of a team would be depending on the track, and how to decide how big to make the team. So if you can speak a little bit to that.
Sure. I think as we talked about earlier, there are some responsibilities around the award itself. The scope of work that's being proposed, the kind of work that needs to get done. And then we talked about sustainability. Right? So it's probably, if you're looking for a team that's going to be paid off of a $300,000 award, it's probably can't be that big of a team. That doesn't mean you can have a team itself. We do ask for a list of collaborators, partners. They can be, quote, on your team. But maybe the question is about how many should be on the team to be paid. That's really up to you. And this gets into some of the budget and the costs that we'll cover on August 11th and how to think about this. And I can't say this enough. It's not a traditional proposal. It's not a traditional R&D proposal you might submit to some other directorate. So if you're thinking about things like, well, a PI and a bunch of grad students or undergraduate students, we want you to think differently, and we'll talk about it in the August 11th. So size matters. You've got to convince NSF why the size that you've selected is appropriate. So if you're working in a very new space and you're trying to get it set up, right, and you've got targets that you want to grow your user community by the end of year one by 75%, your team's going to have to be bigger, or you're going to have to be pulling in more organizations. So it all depends on what your targets are, where do you start from, and where do you want to be? If you're at track 2, you should have some of these things already established. So your team might actually be bigger by nature, right? You already have other organizations involved. You have other users, maintainers. So it really does, the details matter. Is where are you starting? Where do you want to be? What is appropriate? Somebody's going to ask me, what's an appropriate number to target? It's an appropriate number for your discipline, your domain, and for your asset. I can't tell you that. It's your job to convince NSF by doing some sort of analysis and overview of the landscape. What's appropriate? Some areas more mature than others, or domains are more mature than others. And we would expect sometimes in this cutting edge space that you're not going to see big domains. But it might mean that you need more people involved to get the targets or to hit the targets that you want to hit. You've also got to you got to convince NSF and the reviewers that your target's appropriate. So as you're thinking about where you want to go and the growth that you want to achieve, that you're going to put into your plan, if you're only going to grow your community by 10% or 5%, then you've got to justify why. Because we may have other teams that say, we're going to grow it by 50%. So you really do, all of these pieces fit together. And that's why answering this with numbers, like just a random number, doesn't make sense. You've got to put the whole package together, think about where you're starting, where you're going, and why you're going there. And then you've got to look at the landscape and convince yourself that you understand where this particular ecosystem sits as you propose.
Thanks. And the other topic that came up in a handful of questions is about the national interest or national need, and whether open source ecosystems that say support research infrastructure in a specific scientific domain could count, or how to make the link between an open source ecosystem and national need.
Sure. I mean, maybe the simplest answer to think about, what are those big societal national needs? We've covered this in conversations in some of our orientation panels. I would encourage you to go out there and read things like the administration's priorities. You probably have read it somewhere. It's a framing question, right? So if you're talking about the localized needs in your domain, you're probably not going big enough. So as an example, I'll use this again, is the biomedical. You've got, let's say, you're going to produce, or you have some asset, and you think it's going to be helpful localized because of your community. I would ask you, broader impacts, how does this map onto the national scene or the national needs across the United States? That framing and how you think about it, there are lots of sites. You can look at the White House priorities. You can look at NSF sites that really help you frame thinking about it. But connecting the dots between that bigger national need and that bigger societal need and how you're thinking about it at a localized standpoint is something you'll just have to work through by doing a bit of reading. But if you're only talking about your local community, it's probably not a big enough aperture in terms of your thinking or your framing. Ashley or Reed, any other?
I see a couple of questions about the letters of collaboration, and what sort of entity and what sort of commitment in a letter of collaboration makes it a useful or helpful one.
I'm going to punt that one to our August 11th. That is very much outlined in our solicitation. So Ashley, I don't know if you're able to get that and maybe dump it in there so users can read it or attendees can read that. I want to make sure that we're covering some of these bigger questions. I'm going to look at my list as well.
Florence, I was going to say, for those participants who have really mature ecosystems established with many industry members, they're trying to understand where their home is amongst the tracks. Do you feel that their ecosystem would be a strong foundation for a PESOS proposal, provided that the project, clearly describes how it will expand into a sustainable, broader open source community with external contributors and governance? Or should they be, I guess they're trying to ascertain, are they appropriate for the award given the maturity of their ecosystem?
Yeah, so I'm trying to find, because I think it really does help us all think about an answer to this question. So let me try and do this. I can't multitask very well. So if I understand the question right, we've got an entity, a for-profit entity perhaps, or even a nonprofit that has a very mature ecosystem. They've got already an organization that is serving that ecosystem. And I'm going to assume that that ecosystem, because they're saying it's mature, I'm going to look back at this slide, already has a scope or a range of its own assets. So I would say if you're fit into that on the far right-hand side, right, I'm going to guess you're probably on the far right-hand side, that you've got to ask yourself, what is the asset that I'm bringing forward? What is the new asset that I'm bringing forward? And how does that change what we're doing? You already have an organization. You still need to think about how does that organization really need to change in order to support that asset? How many new users are there, right? How are you going to advance knowledge and have broader impacts? So if you find yourself, I think a general rule of thumb is it's just incremental knowledge advancement. And you find that the user community is kind of about the same user community, probably you're at the pinnacle or you're at the max of where NSF or PESOS would be funding it. But if it's really a new asset and you really see an opportunity to open up a new area, advanced knowledge in a new area, or really broaden the impacts, and it's going to require thinking about your users differently, maintainers differently, you're probably then eligible. I'd probably still put you kind of in the middle ground. You could make the argument for 1 or 2, but it's still like, how are you going to tease out the difference between operations today and what you're doing and what you're proposing? That will be the question that I know that reviewers would ask in NSF. What is the difference between what you're doing today and what you're proposing? And is it distinctly different enough intellectually and with regard to broader impacts to warrant a proposal or an award? But I think it's fair game. That was a good question. What else do we have?
I've seen a couple questions around whether an open source ecosystem should be built around a single open source asset or tool, or whether a suite of open source products would make a good, open source ecosystem as a collection.
I think you could make the case for both. We don't have a recipe. We're all going to ask, though, the question is, how is this long-term going to be good enough, right, to move knowledge forward? And maybe you do have an asset, but can you continue this long-term? Can it become sustainable? You're going to need to make the case that the broader impacts are going to go beyond likely the domain that you're in, or maybe it's so novel that there's still a lot of issues or challenges to solve. So you got to be thinking about, if you're only going to go with one asset, why that's sufficient versus is it going to be convincing? Can we start out with 1 or 2 and can we work our way towards more? Should we be working our way towards 1 or 2? In your thought process, this is where your evaluation comes into play, is as you think about where do you want to move? What does that trajectory look like? And how can you convince reviewers that it's the right trajectory? So are you being too ambitious? Are you not being ambitious enough? And how do you know that's the right growth pattern? So there's a bunch of homework that you need to do, which is helpful to the proposal anyway, to establish where your assets and where your ecosystems fit. I know before we leave today, I do want to make sure that we get to this question around asset versus ecosystem, but continue. I want to see what the rest of the questions coming forward are.
Well, that was definitely a question that I was going to raise is open source assets versus ecosystems. So you could tackle that next. The other, yeah, why don't you go to that? And then there was another topic that I was trying to pull out from a collection of questions.
Yes, so I don't have it handy, but I can see it in my head, and I'll also just try to describe it because I think it's a relatively simple concept. If you've got a single individual or maybe 2 people that are working on what I'm going to call this asset, many software programs, it could be open source hardware. It could be a new workflow in a bigger schema. And you're trying to advance that. That is not an ecosystem. So if you remember an ecosystem, and I talked about this in the sustainability components, you've got to have governance. You've got to have maintainers. You've got to have users, contributors, all of the documentation behind that as you bring new people on board, because that's about growing the capacity to maintain it. So if you find yourself with some sort of technology, NSF has other programs for that. Some of these I'd have to do some homework on, as NSF, of course, has really reconfigured itself. But we know for sure, for example, in our computer information and sciences engineering group, our SCIENCE group, they have an infrastructure program that focuses almost solely on these kinds of things, that software. And that's perfectly fine if that's where you want to be. But if you come to us with just the assets and you want to move that forward, that's not for PISOs. We don't fund development, maybe some minor things if it's required for growth, but definitely not the R&D behind a particular piece of infrastructure or asset. But as you start to think about governance and you talk about maintainers and users and putting it out there in the open source, now you're moving into the open source ecosystem realm.
So another topic that's come up is what if there's an open source product that that is most open source but does depend on some bit of software that's licensed or that's not open source. Could that still form an open source ecosystem around, even though there will be some dependency on not open source products?
So I'm not really sure I understand the question. If it's a request about, can I leverage an existing open source ecosystem if I have a product or an asset, can I use their open source ecosystem to further my asset? Is that acceptable? Well, you'd have to ask the open source ecosystem if that's acceptable. And the reviewers in NSF would ask, how are you growing that ecosystem? So we would expect to see some sort of collaboration. Or are you asking if it's dependent on that in order for you to be able to grow it, and that other group has some sort of licensing? That will be a question. If you show no collaboration between the two, then it's going to be hard to convince reviewers that you actually, that you're not working in isolation, right? You won't be able to move this thing forward without getting others involved and getting an agreement on it. So Reed, I'm not sure which one it was, or if
I may not have expressed it that well. I think it was more the latter. Like if there's some dependency of the open source tool on some external bit of technology or software, whether that could still be eligible for a PISOs project.
Sure. Let me just respond to you. We've seen this before. So this is a perfect example where we would expect to see a collaborator letter. You've reached out to that entity where you've got this dependency and you're working together and you say, we understand there's a dependency here. We're all going to try to work together to move this forward. In the absence of that, the reviewers, and this is what happened to an example we had, the reviewers just were not convinced that there was any kind of ability to move the product forward into an open source ecosystem because they had this strong dependency, but no evidence to show that there had been any kind of collaboration or effort to figure out how to work with this dependency or work within what was required. So we don't expect you to solve everything up front, but certainly having the evidence that you've reached out to groups, you understand what the dependency are, and they're going to work with you to kind of find a path forward.
So we have about 10 minutes left in the hour, and I know you wanted about 5 minutes to close, so we have time for a few more questions. One other is, there's a handful of questions about, could the open source ecosystem be about this domain or this domain? So just wanted to open it rather than ask about each specific one, about the sort of diversity of topics and domains that that these awards may be supporting and open source ecosystems could be about.
Sure. So maybe the simplest way to answer this is, first of all, NSF really takes a broad view on what an open source ecosystem and the assets it could be. We're not strictly confining people to software, as you've heard. We also pretty wide in accepting most domains. It really does need to come out of a traditional R&D or STEM field. That is where NSF works, right? So the framing is going to be important. I will speak from some experience that we've had in our biomedical and give you a little bit of an NSF insight on this or perspective on this. If you're working in the biomedical field and you speak in terms of medical solutions, it starts to feel like you're submitting an NIH proposal and you're solving some of the problems that that agency would solve. So you want to think about the technology itself. What is in its most fundamental form and how can it move the field forward? Is it biology that you're trying to move forward? And if that is, speak and frame it in terms of that. So we've had some of these and we spent quite a bit of time really thinking about the review panel, thinking about what is the technology that they have and do we have a framing issue? But pure medical is in of itself, it really is on the, I would say from a domains standpoint, that does start to kind of teeter on where NSF might find it problematic. So think about the framing, the words that you're using. Think about the NSF typical directorates or the places where we really serve, right? Our math, physical sciences, our geosciences, our biology, and frame things within that context and think about the broader impacts and what other domains, but we're pretty wide open on that. I don't know if you can give me an example of something that might seem on the edge. Can you find one that might be a bit?
Well, you did mention healthcare. There were at least a couple of people mentioned healthcare as topics.
Right. So think about if you're familiar with NIH, the quandary that puts NSF in is funding things, projects that might be oriented towards NIH programs versus NSF. But it's really getting you to think about what that technology is and how does it go beyond healthcare? How could it? What is the fundamental pieces of that?
So I'm going to try to squeeze in two more questions. One is a couple people have raised if the open source ecosystem has government partners, or government contributors to it, or if it's serving government users, does that matter, as a plus or minus? So yeah, that, and then I have one more question after that.
So I don't think that it precludes government users, right? The broader, the better. If your only target is government, that's probably going to be hard for us because once again, we're another government agency. Are we paying you, the group, to grow the ecosystem by serving the government in and of itself? So we're paying ourselves. So that's how I want you to think about this. If it's really going to move things forward, I want to ask yourselves, what is the broader audience that's available? Is it just the government and why? And maybe that's too narrow. I do remember, I think we did have one around government and that was the nature of the dialogue, is this feels like it's too narrow. Proposer or reviewers themselves can always think about what the broader community is, but it is incumbent on the proposer, the writer, to convince us, tell us what it is, not for us to try to think through it. So that's a good question.
And then a question specifically about track 3. You've talked a lot about open source products, open source ecosystems, and then the question is, do the the security tools being applied themselves have to be open source, or could you take tools that are not open source to add security to an open source ecosystem for a track 3 project?
Sure. And you're going to ask yourselves, right? Reviewers in NSF is going to ask yourself, if it's a non-open source, if it's a licensed solution, in the context of open source, how is that going to work? Right? So if you're taking something that's closed or that's licensed that requires a licensing around it, then don't you have another problem beyond just the solution of the vulnerability? So thank you, Ashley. I know we're closing in on time, and I want to raise this. We know we had a lot of questions, a lot of people, that if there's enough demand, we're going to look at the questions. We will have another webinar on these broad questions. So stay tuned for that. And how will you stay tuned for that? But before I jump there, let me share with you before we close things out, what's happening in addition to the one I just talked about. So we know that we've got a lot of, let me move through this. I don't know why that does that. We know that we have new entities or even seasoned entities that maybe have not been on research.gov or don't even know some of the other requirements. So we will be scheduling office hours on this piece on August 5th. Our target audience are these new proposers or somebody that just hasn't been on the site for a very, very long time. It's going to be pretty mechanical, but important if you've never worked with this. I would encourage you, if you've never ever submitted to NSF, get on this August 5th webinar. We have one of the very seasoned r.gov, we say, developers and supporters of this, Stephanie Yee. She's going to be leading that. I'll be in the background in case we bump into anything that's more programmatic. But she and I have already talked about, she and I read the scope of that versus the next webinar, August 11th, that I've mentioned. This is about proposal preparation. I know many groups will not find this useful, but I would actually encourage you to come. We're going to talk about some of those questions in detail about what do these I-Corps teams look like. We're going to talk about budgets as well, because there are questions around for reviewers. What's the reasonability, what's the reasonableness of the budget? And you might be thinking, well, I know how to do this. I've written a proposal before. Well, you may not have thought about this in the context of how it's looked at in this program. So that one should prove to be very helpful if you've never proposed in TIP before. Very different than an R&D proposal. So both of these are on our schedule, August 5th, August 11th. How will you know about this? Reach out with us. There's a QR code. You can put something in the mailbox. We run through these as fast as we can. We can't guarantee we always get everything. We do the best we can. I want to say that tell us about an OSC if you have one. And please let us know if you're interested in a conference that we funded on open source. We're calling it a summit now. So we'd love to hear with you on that. If you're not ready and you're feeling quite overwhelmed, or you just want to take your time, we encourage you to be a PISOs reviewer. It's the best way to get insights and to see how we think about this in the context with real examples coming forward. If you're proposing, though, for the September 1st deadline, you can't be on the first round. But if you're not submitting until the March, we'll be finished with that round. And so you can be a reviewer, as long as you don't trip up any of the other conflicts. And then last, and that also will get you kind of looped into getting these alerts. And I want to thank everyone. I know there's lots of questions. I do think they're going to post this webinar on the page, which is nice, which is why you want to have that. We'll let you know if there's this other webinar, if we need that, another hour or so. We're just going to jump into some of those, and we're going to try to get these FAQs posted. So you'll have the broader set of slides along with these other FAQs that are a little bit more expansive. So thanks to everyone for coming. Appreciate all of the good questions and engagement. Take care.